Greetings, brothers and sisters, to this Holy Week devotional. The title for this devotional is Gethsemane. We are jumping over a few things that Jesus did with his disciples after eating the Passover meal and establishing what we today call communion. He takes the disciples out and they go to this place called Gethsemane. So before we go any further, again, I just invite you to read the text that's associated. This time I'm going to point you to the book of Mark chapter 14, verses 32 to 42. Mark 14, 32 to 42. Again, if you have not already read it, just hit pause real quickly and go read the text and then come back and pick up with what I'm saying. Jesus takes his disciples, he has them sit down, invites them to stay there while he goes and prays. He takes Peter, James, and John with them. He goes a little farther, and the text is clear. In Mark, it says he begins to be, his soul is very sorrowful, he says, and is troubled. He's distressed. He says even to the point of death is how troubled Jesus is. And then we see this little recurring scene of Jesus goes just a short distance away from the three. He falls down on his knees, perhaps on his face. He's praying to God. He's asking God for some things. And then he comes back and finds them sleeping, despite having asked of them to stay awake and to pray with him. And this happens 3 times. And finally, of course, the very end of that scene is where Judas is making his approach to betray Jesus into the hands of the chief priests and eventually into the hands of the Romans. We know where all this is going. Jesus knows where all this is going. And this is, to me, is the crux of Jesus' passion and the decision he is making. We look to the cross, which is coming, and the great suffering that Jesus had. But I would point to this moment, these moments in the Garden of Gethsemane, as really the crux, really the place that paves the way for the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. For it is in this place that we see Jesus surrendering his will. Now, you could maybe say we are splitting hairs, and you could maybe say, well, all this really began years earlier, in our perspective, years earlier, where Jesus surrendered himself and said to his Father, yes, I will go and take on flesh and be born as a servant to people and humble myself. But here we really comes to the forefront where Jesus is in agony. He is crying out to God. And I love his prayer. Pay attention to his prayer when we are in need. And as you know, brothers and sisters, most of us find ourselves in some need all times of our life, but certainly right now we are pressed in. We are in a difficult situation. We have panic around us. We have a pandemic around us. We have routine just uprooted and thrown out, and we're in for lots of us in sort of unprecedented times. And his prayer is so simple. Now, I don't know that this is the only thing he said, but this is what we have recorded, the only thing we have recorded. Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. And I love how we get a complete picture of prayer just in those 2 little sentences. And pause for a moment. Think of what he says. He addresses God as his Father. Now, you might say, well, of course, God is his Father. He's the Son of God. But what he has done for us enables us to have the same kind of approach, to cry out, to say, Abba, Father. And he's very direct with God. First, he proclaims his faith and his trust in God that all things are possible. And then he says, remove this cup. I wish this could be taken. I wish we could do it some other way. I wish it would be possible to perform some other function or to do some other way or for you to remove this from us. But he says in the end, not what I want, but what you want. He surrenders. These are the words that Jesus is pointing forward to, actually, when he said, anyone who would lay down his life, anyone who would recognize that a grain of wheat has to fall to the ground and die, anyone who would die to himself and take up his cross and follow me. These are the words he's pointing to. Friends, if you want to walk the path of Jesus, it begins with this. Every great act for God is preceded with a laying down of our wills, of saying, God, not my way, but yours. But there's something else going on that we have to pay attention to, because as he is doing this himself, he is going back to his three disciples, and they are really just a small picture of what's happening with the broader disciples, because I'm sure they were all sleeping actually. And he's going and he's exhorting them, stay awake and pray. The word stay awake is the Greek word gregoriuo, which means, of course, to stay awake, to watch, to be vigilant. And of course, pray is the Greek word proseukomai, which means to worship or to be in supplication, to pray to God. Those two things coupled together carry the weight of what he's looking, the position he's looking for his followers to have. Stay awake and pray. And friends, if you're like me, you know that it's difficult to stay awake and pray. I only say this half jokingly, but many times if I'm awake at night during the evening, during the nighttime, and I can't fall asleep, I pray. Because I know that when I'm praying, I often get sleepy and I fall asleep. And maybe some of that is just the peace that is brought into my heart, into my mind as I'm taking things to the Father. But all of us probably have fought that battle. Why is it so difficult to stay awake? And yet, the times we find ourselves in, Jesus is exhorting us, stay awake, be vigilant, and pray. Don't be vigilant and get all worked up about what's happening around us. Don't be vigilant and try to point out all the things people are doing wrong. Don't be vigilant with all the conspiracy of stuff that might be going around us. But be vigilant and pray. Take things to the one for whom all things are possible, and then repeatedly lay down your will and say, not what I want, but what you want, God. This is where God wants every one of us to again say, Jesus has walked this path. Am I willing to walk the same path? Are there things in your lives, friends, that you need to lay down your will, that you need to surrender to God in? Are you willing to fall on your face before him, though your soul be in great distress, though you be troubled to what you think is maybe even the point of death, that you will say, God, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Would you take this cup from me? Nevertheless, not what I want, but what you want. I'm so grateful Jesus is a good, tender shepherd, and he recognizes that though our spirits may be willing, our flesh is weak, but it's in that weakness that God's strength is perfected in us. Are you willing to walk the path of suffering that Jesus walked? Are you willing to look at your current situation right now and say, God, you can do everything. You can remove this from me. But in the end, it's more important that you do what you want in my life than I get what I want. This is Gethsemane for each one of us. Take heart, for Jesus demonstrated that God rewards those who lay themselves down before him and say, not my will, but yours.